In the northern Caribbean, just 145 kilometers from the U.S. mainland, sits a small island of 110,000 square kilometers and 9.7 million people. This is Cuba, for decades the most unruly thorn in America's backyard. Under Castro, it became a stronghold of anti-American resistance. During the Cold War, it was a Soviet nail driven into the Caribbean, nearly dragging two superpowers into nuclear war. After the Cold War, it kept confronting Washington with its posture of anti-Americanism, anti-sanctions, and anti-hegemony for decades more. Now, in 2026, that old adversary has reached its most dangerous moment. Power outages, fuel shortages, food scarcity, medicine deficits, currency collapse. A systemic crisis is breaking out across Cuba on every front from the inside out, and at the same time, the Trump administration has not let this window pass. After successive trade sanctions, energy blockades, and financial pressure, on May 20th, 2026, U.S. Southern Command deployed the USS Nimitz carrier strike group into the Caribbean. The message is unmistakable. America is telling Havana that time is running out. After Venezuela and Iran, Cuba is Trump's next target. I do believe I'll have the honor of taking Cuba. Cuba's next. To understand why Cuba has arrived at this moment, we need to rewind the clock. Under Batista's rule, the Cuban people had no freedom. He protected only the elite, accepted bribes openly, and helped foreign companies extract Cuba's wealth. He sold off vast amounts of Cuban land. 70% of the country's plantations ended up in foreign hands. He maintained close ties with Washington, encouraging American investment in exchange for weapons, which were mostly used to suppress domestic opposition. Popular resentment built for years. Then, in 1959, Fidel Castro led a revolution. Land reform was launched. The assets of landlords and foreign businesses were seized, including American sugar mills, oil refineries, and plantations. This struck directly at America's core interests and ignited a trade war. By 1962, the Kennedy administration imposed a full trade embargo, severing Cuba from the United States. America assumed that under heavy pressure, Cuba's economy and government would collapse. It never happened. For nearly 30 years, Cuba exported sugar, tobacco, and fruit to the Soviet Union in exchange for cheap oil. The Soviets helped train Cuban doctors and soldiers. Throughout the Cold War, with Soviet backing, Cuba survived, even thrived, by its own modest standards. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the lifeline was cut. Since fuel-powered generation made up 80% of Cuba's electricity production, the loss of Soviet oil immediately triggered an energy crisis. Industry ground to a halt. Large-scale riots broke out. To consolidate power during this chaos, Castro allowed dissatisfied Cubans to leave. Most of them flooded into Florida, a detail that would matter enormously for American politics decades later. To revive the economy, Raul Castro led the military into economic construction and established GAESA, a military-controlled commercial group that ran tourism, foreign trade, retail, finance, and logistics. Cuba opened its doors to tourism and allowed some dollar circulation. It was a survival strategy, not a transformation. Then came the real turning point. Venezuela's Hugo Chavez came to power. A staunch anti-American and ideological ally of Havana, Chavez began sending large quantities of subsidized oil to Cuba in exchange for Cuban medical and military services. With Venezuela as a backer, Cuba's economy stabilized. The crisis was paused, not solved. Throughout all of this, America's stance toward Cuba never softened. The hardline policies were fueled by Florida's large Cuban-American community, many of whom had fled after the 1959 revolution and harbored deep resentment toward the Castro government. They consistently pushed for harsh sanctions, and every election cycle, American politicians courted their votes. During the Clinton era, lifting the Cuba embargo was made an exclusive congressional prerogative specifically to prevent any future president from unilaterally ending it. During Obama, a slight relaxation in policy immediately drew fierce opposition from Cuban-American leaders, including then Senator Marco Rubio, himself the descendant of Cuban immigrants. When Trump arrived, he tightened the screws to honor his promises to Florida voters. Cuba's access to the international financial system was impaired. Foreign exchange revenues dropped sharply. Biden changed little. But in Trump's second term, the pressure intensified dramatically. The U.S. pressured countries to stop paying Cuban doctors abroad. Any nation supplying Cuba with oil was threatened with heavy tariffs and secondary sanctions. Traditional suppliers like Mexico and Venezuela drastically reduced their exports to Cuba. Then, in January 2026, the U.S. arrested Venezuelan President Maduro. Cuba lost its last major backer overnight. Without external oil supply, Cuba's situation became catastrophic. In the summer of 2026, Cubans spend almost every day in darkness. Most residents endure power outages lasting 20 hours or more. On May 14, part of Cuba's national power grid collapsed entirely, cutting electricity to most of the eastern part of the country. In the sweltering heat, with no power and no relief in sight, basic life has become nearly impossible. Cuba's energy minister admitted on state media what everyone already knew. Cuba has completely exhausted its fuel supply. There are no reserves. But the blackouts are just a symptom. The deeper disease is total economic collapse. The Cuban peso has been in free fall from 40 pesos to the dollar in 2021 to 400 pesos by 2025. Hyperinflation has emptied state store shelves. The average monthly wage is 6,649 pesos. A carton of eggs costs 3,000. During tight periods, 30 eggs can sell for 6,500 pesos, nearly one full month's salary for an ordinary worker. State stores have little stock and high prices. The only places with goods are private stores, but they only accept US dollars, which most ordinary Cubans simply don't have. Access to foreign currency is firmly controlled by government and military elites. Statistics show that 89% of Cubans now live in extreme poverty. Between 2021 and 2025, prolonged blackouts and shortages triggered several large-scale protests. The government responded with crackdowns and arrests. Domestic media is banned. The internet is monitored. And so, with no voice and no future visible, Cubans left. Between 2020 and 2025, nearly 2 million people fled the country, 18% of the entire population. The exodus has further hollowed out the economy, leaving Cuba in what looks like irreversible decline. The Cuban government blames all of this on the American blockade. And the blockade is real. But there is another critical reason that rarely gets mentioned: the parasites bleeding Cuba from the inside. That parasite has a name: GAESA. GAESA was founded by Castro in the 1990s. It controls Cuba's most profitable industries: five-star hotels, banks, duty-free shops, supermarkets, gas stations, and more. On the surface, it is a commercial holding group. In reality, it is controlled by the Cuban military and serves as the primary income source for the government, military, and ruling elite. It is the economic engine through which power is maintained. By outside estimates, GAESA controls at least 40% of the Cuban economy, with annual revenues 3 times the national budget. None of it goes toward improving people's lives. Foreign media estimates GAESA holds around $9 billion in cash enough to buy emergency medicines, repair the power grid, and provide meaningful relief. They have done nothing. The money stays locked in elite hands. Ordinary Cubans earn peso wages. They shop at bare state stores. They survive on limited rations. Meanwhile, those with dollars live in an entirely different world, one with stocked shelves, private restaurants, and functional lives. The revolutionary promise of equality exists only in speeches, but GAESA is more than an economic parasite. It is the wall standing between Cuba and any meaningful reform. Opening the market and introducing competition would directly cut into GAESA's revenues. So the military and government that control it have every reason to block reform, and they do. GAESA is not just getting rich off Cuba's misery. It is actively ensuring that misery continues, because change would threaten its grip. America has read the situation clearly. Cuba's regime is approaching a tipping point. The population is suffering, emigrating, and increasingly angry. The economy is in free fall. The government has no reserves and no viable plan. External pressure, applied at the right moment, could be the final straw. Add to that the approaching U.S. midterm elections. Trump needs to show Florida's Cuban-American voters, the same community that has driven Cuba policy for decades, that he is not just tough in words, but decisive in action. On May 1, the White House issued a fact sheet laying out America's justification for its pressure campaign. Cuba causes regional instability. It is aligned with countries hostile to the U.S. It hosts foreign military and intelligence installations. It suppresses domestic opposition. Its collapse drives mass immigration toward American borders, and it sits just 145 kilometers from U.S. soil. The conclusion: Cuba's current regime is a direct threat to American national security. That same day, Trump signed a new executive order expanding sanctions with a specific focus on GAESA and its core leadership. Targeting GAESA is both an economic and political move. Economically, it cuts off one of Cuba's last functioning revenue streams. Politically, it sends a message directly to the Cuban people: your suffering is not the fault of America alone. Your own government is robbing you. On May 7th, the U.S. imposed financial sanctions on GAESA's joint mining venture with a Canadian company, banning American firms from transacting with it and warning all foreign companies that doing business with GAESA risks secondary sanctions. The choice was simple: Cuba or America. No serious company would choose Cuba. This severed another major source of foreign exchange for the regime. Trump is no longer just cutting off ties between Cuba and America. He is cutting Cuba off from the entire world. The Trump administration's goal is clear: use total economic strangulation to force the Cuban regime to negotiate, change its political and economic system, and ultimately install leadership more acceptable to Washington. But there is a complication. Cuba's nominal leader is Diaz-Canel. The real power belongs to 94-year-old Raul Castro, officially retired, but still firmly in control of the military in GAESA. To achieve genuine regime change, Raul Castro's entire system must be dismantled. And under U.S. law, as long as the Castro family holds power, Congress cannot lift the embargo. A new government, one without the Castros, is a legal prerequisite for any normalization. So on May 20, the U.S. filed criminal charges against Raul Castro, accusing him of involvement in the 1996 shootdown of an American aircraft that killed 4 Cuban-American civilians. The indictment gives America a legal basis to seek his arrest and prosecution. On the very same day, the USS Nimitz entered the Caribbean, a clear display of military force directly alongside legal pressure. The message to Havana is now complete: economic, financial, legal, and military pressure, all converging at once. America may force the Cuban government to sign an agreement on its terms, or it may replicate what happened in Venezuela and move to arrest Castro outright, restructuring the Cuban regime from the top down. Either way, the walls are closing in. Cuba's time is running out. We wait for time to give us the answer.